Thank you. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes,
Is
we
all
can.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And also thank you to Aya, Hiba, and the rest of the extraterritorial studio. It's been really wonderful to listen into such powerful work across the last 2 days. So I'm Sarah. I'm an architectural designer of South African and a bit of Sicilian descent, and somehow found myself in the UK currently, where my interest in unpacking colonial, historical, and contemporary circulations through material remains in my work. Some of the thinking in this work carries traces of earlier conversations and encounters with teaching, by teaching within a master studio with some amazing students and tutors that I was very lucky to work with and also learn from in Johannesburg. In that context, we were exploring how Cairo might be read through Johannesburg and vice versa. While the link is not direct, certain questions and sensibilities from that moment have remained for me, resurfacing in more diffuse ways. The project shown on the screen is by Zaha Essa, whose work attends to the site of bread making within the home, while also tracing the circulation of food composites across the spice and silk routes. Her approach brings these movements into dialogue with granite, so granite surfaces that you make the bread on, and its stratified presence in architecture, using food as a way of thinking through material and spatial histories. These projects developed within a short brief co-written with a colleague who also presented here, Huda Tayab, in our broader unit, Unit 18, and the brief was called Recipes of an Atmosphere. And this was a brief to be accompanied to the conference we were holding called Dialogues with Dust, which we hosted. Dialogues with Dust considered a series of dialogues, and these raised phenomena relevant to Egypt, Namibia, and Johannesburg, looking at these three locations together and their hauntings, ideas of dust, specters, edge conditions, all of their ancient deserts, or the idea of sand and displacement of sand, and also contemporary global catastrophes. It was held during the time of the first COVID outbreak, and because of this, also considered relationships with entanglements and the impact on health, as well as territory and climate. Althea Peacock also spoke so beautifully and poignantly of dust this morning, which was lovely. For us in this project, the notion of dust, we also looked at phenomena long since dormant against those ruptured, urgent, and insurgent aspects in the atmospheres we inhabit. So it was perhaps something to connect here in terms of durational thinking. Later that year in practice, we worked on a project for Istanbul Biennale, and that looked at the tracing specifically the historical origins of ingredients in certain types of recipes. In Egypt and Morocco, together with my colleague Samea, we both had different units working in Fez and Cairo separately. But in this project, within the specters of the undercommons, and in the wake of such catastrophe, which haunts such precious territories and communities, I was curious to shift the frame to understand recipes within economic and geopolitical forces and how they remain diffuse but resilient and a powerful thread which holds transformation and endures it. The knowledge at stake in this work is a little elusive, not fully captured. It is carried in the presence of a palm rolling grain, in the calibration of heat by watching the color of a bean in a pot, in the proportion of cumin that no recipe has ever needed to specify because the hand already knows. Until the 19th century, most recipes were not really written down. In this sense, the recipe was never intended as a complete system, but as a supplement to collective situated knowledge, not quite stable. Recipes refer to here not necessarily in their text form, but rather their practiced embodied forms are the accumulated intelligence of bodies in relation to materials and in relation to land. To think with recipes is to think with matter. Mariana Mazzucato calls the device dividing what an economy counts as productive from what it dismisses as the production boundary. Cotton in British-occupied Egypt sat within the lines of the productive. It was taxed, insured, graded, priced on exchanges that then went on to Liverpool in the UK. Full medermes, the dish that fed the bodies harvesting that cotton in Egypt, did not. It occupied no line in any ledger or a fold in its margins. Invisible, yet as a key staple, it remained necessary and structurally unconsidered. Consider the irony. Full medermes was a fuel economy, cooked in the dying heat of bathhouse fires. It powered the bodies that powered the fields. That it never appeared in the same institutional register as cotton or coal or irrigation, for example. That it was a fuel without ever being counted as such is the production boundary at work. Foucault describes the apparatus as a heterogeneous ensemble of institutions, infrastructures, laws, and administrative measures, organized around a dominant strategic function. Here, the apparatus could be framed as those strategic institutes through those like the British irrigation network in the Nile Valley, built to extend the cotton season, or the railway engineered to reach the port from the site of extraction. The legal regime that priced the cotton as value and also classified subsistence as backwardness at the same time. More recently, it is the Gulf agribusiness lease on Sudanese farmland and the structural adjustment program that converted Egypt's grain economy into an import dependency. Apparatuses capture. They render matter as property by in many ways severing it from its constitutive relations. Consider the infamous Cavendish banana, cultivated in English glasshouses, perfected for long-distance shipping, emboldened by the technologies of the steamship, refrigeration, planted across colonized land until it replaced every local cultivar in its path. And colleagues in cooking sections, or Akil Scaife-Smith, and even Francois Verge have been looking at this in particular. If you start looking at every banana cultivar or certain types of sugar, you start understanding centuries of violence that are still inflicted upon people and landscapes, cooking sections right. And as someone once said, a banana plantation is a poor place to live unless you are a banana. Here, the banana was captured. However, here I make a shift towards the idea of holding in place of active capture. The distinction between capture and holding is proposed here as a way of reading what Hartman and Wilderson describe as the position of the unthought, not what has been forgotten, but what must remain invisible for the system to function. Catherine Yusof describes geological extraction cutting matter from its constitutive relations. Food practices perhaps do something a little different. They are an interface directly with matter, a daily site of transformation where the body meets the world with little mediation of the market, as they are minor and work in dissipated, elusive systems. This work reads 3 dishes through modes of holding, accompanying it as a series of mappings, tracings of the invisible vast networks of passages across continents and across time, over and through lines of control, displacement and inscription, as well as subversive and the insurgent. They connect ingredient to coastline, preparation to geopolitical formation. Buried economics, 2. Drain and rinse the fava beans. Heat over medium with water. Season with salt and cumin. Mash with the back of a fork. Squeeze lemon, drizzle oil. The word medermes comes from the Coptic for buried. In medieval Cairo, the making of fool was monopolized by families near the Princess Baths in the old center. At night, when the fires for the baths died down, the residual heat was harvested, clay pots packed with fava beans buried in the embers left to simmer through the night. A food economy was then folded into a fuel economy, emerging already in slightly subversive ways. The Aswan Low Dam, completed in 1902, extended the cotton season through year-round irrigation. Water that had previously sustained food agriculture was redirected to extend the cotton season. Egypt went from being food surplus provider to a food importer for the first time in its modern history around 1900. Lord Cromer ensured that the cotton left Egypt as raw fibre and re-entered as finished cloth. No local manufacturing permitted, no value added, no economic return. The colony fed England's mills and nothing was given back. By 1925, the Gezira scheme was the world's largest centrally managed irrigation project in this region. Tenants were required to grow cotton. What fed their families was left to them. The so-called production boundary fence was therefore in effect built here in the Nile Valley from concrete and canals for the irrigation system. Full absorbed this. When fibre supply tightened, other legumes folded in, lentils, white beans, whatever the season yielded. The dish did not cease. It substituted to a form of endurance. Timothy Mitchell describes colonial Egypt as governed through rule of experts, technical regimes rendering certain practices visible and others inert. Full as a microcosm of sustenance and food culture was in essence inert through this. Yet it was such a key caloric ground on which everything the experts built depended on, occupying, to borrow Hani and Mouton's phrase, a position in, but not of, the economy that required it. The fibre circulates beyond Egypt to Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, southern Italy's pasta con la fava, stitching legume economies through exchange that no agreement has really formalized. Three, traveling grain. Sift the semolina into a wide shallow dish. Sprinkle with salted water. Roll the grains between your palms until each granule is separate and light. Steam. Couscous has been in motion for probably as long as there have been borders to cross. Amazigh in origin and pre-Islamic in practice, it carries the sediment of probably every geography it has passed through without settling into any one. Its base, durum wheat semolina, was disrupted by a French colonial land expropriation across Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Grain economies restructured for export, wartime rationing was imposed. The dish persisted, carried in the daily sustenance of people across the affected regions, from Maghreb to Algiers. Algeria, 1962. After 7 years of war for independence, the French administration departed, taking with it the infrastructure of daily enforced governance. Malika Rahal demonstrates how collective food sharing became an immediate mode of self-organization. Couscous was on the table at collective food gatherings along long tables. The keskes, the device for making the couscous, has two chambers, grain above and broth below, steam rising through the vessel's body. The dish assembles in strata, each pass rendering the semolina lighter. In Trapani, West Sicily, couscous arrived through the Arab-Norman trade. Semolina meeting fish, and also the dish meeting tomato. The tomato is a New World fruit, known in Europe or unknown in Europe before the 1540s, introduced to the Levant by a British consul in Aleppo as late as the early 1800s. And now it's foundational in so many dishes on either side of the Mediterranean. In 2020, UNESCO inscribed couscous as intangible cultural heritage, not value conferred, but perhaps a kind of version of the boundary in motion. Here we have a tiny bit of economic acknowledgement or legibility, whilst before encountered domestic labour, wide accounts of women's knowledge and informal transmission of value went largely unseen, and still continues to. Couscous holds multiple imperial histories solved in a single bowl, but also in its many variants without resolving them. Laurent Bellant's observation that structure is really a convergence of force and value in patterns of movement, cited by Yusuf, finds an unexpected instance in the couscous part. Displacement and adaptation converged into the pattern that endures, perhaps also because it moves. Four, the seasoned remainder. Crush garlic with salt, add cumin, paprika, a thread of olive oil, and stir into the soup. The apparatus Basara navigates is Morocco's own. The Green Morocco Plan redirected subsidies and water towards export-orientated agriculture, in Morocco, tomatoes, citrus, avocados for European tables, while the traditional rain-fed crops that feed Moroccan tables were left without institutional support. Fava beans are smallholder dryland, unsubsidized, and foundational to Basara. Morocco now imports more than half of its wheat, 100% of its corn, and 98% of its seed oils. When the base diminishes, flavor compounds. Billing and Sherman's cross-cultural study of spice once found that the cuisines under conditions of food precarity use more spices and more potent ones as the dietary base simplifies and storage grows precarious, spice intensifies and serves for the preservation of the food, also improving its health. Cumin has been present in Egypt since around 3000 BCE, in New Kingdom sites, in mummification, in offering. Unlike banana or sugar, both fully restructured by plantation monoculture, cumin persists across every successive empire without registering a rupture. A space below the production boundary, doing cumulative and uncounted work, although interestingly also serving as currency at some point. Colonial interests did not recognize local cuisines as value, which also meant sometimes that they left them undisturbed. To read these practices as endurance is not to celebrate the conditions that produced their isolation, but to attend carefully to what persisted within them. The production boundary cuts both ways. What it renders invisible is also sometimes what it fails to destroy. 5. Duration and what remains. Recipes offer one register for attending to the way catastrophe endures in the everyday practice, in things that were never counted. They are not the undercommons, but they operate in its vicinity, knowledge produced below the institutional recognition, carried in gesture and proportion, sustained by labor and the production boundary, which has left it largely uncounted. What it holds is the intelligence of material, the calibration of duration, the knowledge of what to do when there is not enough, and this troubles the same boundaries. The critical mappings accompanying this text connect the kitchen to the coastline and the ingredient to the geopolitical formation. They attend to the material conditions through which food practices persist alongside catastrophe, asking what becomes legible when sustenance rather than extraction organizes the map. Thank you for listening.